It's 6:30, so I'll call the meeting to order. We have a quorum and the agenda was properly posted. So this is the public appearances, public's opportunity to speak. We have no one in the room. I'll just ask if there's anyone on Zoom that would like to speak. You can push your mouse over the react button and use the raise hand feature, and we can unmute you. Seeing none online, we're going to move to number 4, discuss and consider the minutes of the Budget Review Committee meeting from October 13th, 2025. Those meeting minutes are listed as a PDF in the agenda.
I would move approval as presented.
I'll second.
Motion by Heidi, second by Brittany. All different names tonight. Any other discussion on the meeting minutes? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain?
Abstain.
Motion carries. All right, so we're going to move on to the presentation of the 2025 financial statements. There's 2 PDFs in the agenda, and I think I'll turn it over to Cameron for a rundown on those statements.
So heavy agenda items today. A lot of the items could be talked about individually for half hour to an hour. I'm going to give a high-level overview of some of the documents that are included, why they were included for some of the discussion tonight. So first up, presentation of the 2025 financial statements. Baker Tilly was at the May 4th, 2026 meeting to present to the village board. So if you're looking to kind of get caught up on the official Baker Tilly presentation, that would be the YouTube to go back and listen to. The actual document is shared on the screen. If I was a member of the public or a member of this committee and I had 10 minutes and I had to review the financial statements, I would go directly to the management discussion and analysis. This portion of that document is really intended to give a high-level snapshot of how the village performed in the last fiscal year. So very positive overall financial results for 2025. There's some statutory, or not statutory, rules regarding on the format and things that are required to be in here, but there's a lot of flexibility where if either the board or budget review would want like a paragraph to touch on something, we can certainly add those to the financial statements, as this is really the area that we can kind of have some more control on. So as part of the MD&A, there is a section that we talk about how the general fund did specifically. When we talk about the general fund, we'll talk about each of the key expenditure areas. So for any governmental entity, you have general government, public safety, public works, culture, rec, and education, conservation and development, and capital. So all areas very solid. We did see, again, some efficiencies with some vacant positions. As we were filling positions throughout the year, we recognize those cost savings because those positions weren't filled and paying those salaries. In addition to typically when we're replacing people, that's earlier on the pay scale for public safety, which generates some saving. And then we had one member who was out of service, but returning here for military service. From a capital perspective, there was some significant developer contributed capital in this last year. So oftentimes for public improvements, we require developers to install water main, sewer main, lift station, public roads. That's treated as a capital asset on the village perspective and depreciated. But again, that's recognized as essentially income because it's a capital basically donated. And so that on the front schedules of the financial statements or the document that says government-wide and business-type activities, I think from an operational level, that's challenging to look at and actually get anything out of. The fund level statements that have the titles like general fund, debt service, capital projects, that's much more meaningful from an operation perspective when you're evaluating. With that being said, as I kind of mentioned, the capital assets being significant. There were significant investment in capital assets again in 2025. Continued work on the police station, some major improvements outside of the annual street and roads projects, which included the intersection of Main and Taylor, as well as the path that was ultimately put in construction and progress, but will be finalized or was finalized a couple weeks ago. That being said, contributed public improvements, we had almost $1.4 million of contributed capital related to Hayday and Quarry Ridge Phase C on the governmental side, and then an additional $2.3 million worth of utility infrastructure with a combination of Hayday, Hydrite, Quarry Ridge, 5th Edition, West Lawn Phase 5, and of course Amazon. Obviously, at one point in time, we have to, once we assume that capital, its replacement cost is at Village's expense. So that's part of why, from a governmental accounting standards, it has to be recorded and recognized as a capital expense, because that depreciation expense is a real expense to the village as we plan for replacements. However, on the utility side, we are not allowed in our rates to recover depreciation on contributed assets. And so, like our community, like Verona or other communities that have significant contributed capital, once that capital eventually needs to be replaced, there's some anticipation where we would see some of those rates that factor into the rate. So if we can't include it, and then 30, 50 years later we replace it, that's now going to be part of that base. That being said, debt activity. We started the year in general debt obligations, again, we're talking historical here, at 31.9 million, ended up at 31.7 of our debt capacity. We paid off slightly more debt than we took out last year. And then just a section on, again, with the standard change for the MD&A section, it's important not only to focus on current kind of events, but also key changes that happened in the past year. So there was a fire compensation model change where, with the addition of pay per call, that's a relevant thing to call out. That wasn't in 2025 financial results, but certainly has an impact as a credit rating or our stakeholders understanding that there was a change. So we call out some of our union agreements on the police and EMS side. And then we certainly call out the closure of TID 5 because that has such a significant effect on future financial statements. I would expect a similar footnote now that there's a statement here, Amazon's distribution center, an estimated $295 million. If you've been listening to village board meetings, we have a preliminary estimated value of $400 million, and that we found out that about a week or so ago. So again, we have to be conservative in what we put in here. So over conservative on the potential liabilities and under conservative on the positives, just to make sure that the relevant information is in there. As we kind of look at, again, this is what I was talking about, the statement that I find less valuable for the readers with governmental activities and the business type activities. It's just not an operational good income statement or balance sheet to look at, just because it factors in some adjustments that aren't necessarily day to day and really don't measure truly what cash is hitting on your day-to-day financial. So those are the things like WRS has a pension liability. So we recognize the pension liability or asset along with deferred outflows and inflows. However, that pension plan is 100% funded. So yes, while we're recording a liability, it's a liability that is projecting if we closed our doors at the end of the year, this is what we would have to pay to the state. And that's nothing that will ever hit operationally. That's adjusted year to year in contribution rates to make sure that that's 100% funded. Similarly, other post-employment benefits or other type of long-term receivables are recognized in this statement, and why it's not recognized in the fund level statements is it's all about kind of current economic availability of funds. So yes, it's good to know on this schedule that I have a 30-year asset that I'm going to be able to collect, but it doesn't impact our decisions that we're making for the following year because those resources aren't available. So that would inflate our unassigned fund balance and potentially show maybe we have 45% of unrestricted funds, but we only have access to, let's say, 2 million. So that's kind of the difference between this front level statement and the back one, and why I strongly recommend as policymakers, when you're looking at the financial statements, looking at the balance and income statements, as that's true performance, and really looking more at the current year actual performance. So our general fund this past year, total equity ended up at 2.7 million, which was roughly about 35% of our overall fund balance. I'll kind of flip now documents to go to the financial statement highlights. And this is something that Amanda presented again on that May 4th meeting. So really, unassigned fund balance is the key fund balance to look at. I also want to just note this is not the fund balance we have at any given time of the year. So June and July are, from a cash flow perspective, our lowest months of available kind of funds. And then the remainder of the year, based off of when we're getting our tax revenue and our intergovernmental aids, could be higher. So when we look at things like non-spendable, those might be commitments where we paid for an expense at the end of the year, but it's an actual 2020 subsequent year expenditure. So that's recognized that yes, we have this asset from a prepaid perspective, but it's not again available to be able to use in that subsequent budget or decisions. And then assigned fund balance, that's typically included in your unassigned fund balance to get unrestricted. So it's important to know our unrestricted fund balance calculation is the combination of the unassigned and assigned fund balance. And that's how we get to that 30, because the only reason why it's assigned is that's our pilot payment, or the payment that the water utility makes to the general fund. And it's just assigned for not 2020, in this case, 2025 expenditures. It's incorporated that tax payment is essentially used for 2026 budgeted items and every year and so on and so on. We budgeted a $150,000 deficit because we were above our, correction. The original budget, we budgeted at a $0 impact on the general fund because we knew at a certain point in the year that we were going to have a higher fund balance than was from our policy. We recommended a $150,000 spend down, transferred some money to debt service to reduce the levy in 2026. So that was a budgeted anticipated loss of $150,000. We actually did better than that by $288,000, or recognized a $138,000 gain in the general fund. And again, most of that was driven by those public safety vacancies. So yes, we met a lot of our budget expectations from the expenditure perspective, but it's unrealistic to count on vacancies year to year. So obviously we're not striving or intentionally inflating a budget to generate a surplus. This is again a result of vacancies. The next statement here again is kind of that graph over time, including 2025. Because we budgeted a zero surplus budget in 2026, naturally, as expenditures increase, your percentage of fund balance would decrease just as a pure factor that you're increasing your denominator. According to our 2026 budget, we'd estimate to drop down from 35.1% to like 35.0%. So a small decrease, but it's just something to keep in mind as general fund expenditures come up. Even if we break even every year, we'll continue to see a little bit of a degradation there. Last year, again, was a little bit of a artificial dip. And why there was an artificial dip there is our fund balance policy is based off of expenditures. So when we paid the Amazon permit, which again, we collect the revenue and then we remit a certain portion of that revenue for building inspection. So when we had that expenditure, that created a larger expenditure that's not, and we're talking to the tune of almost $1 million. So when you have a non-reoccurring expenditure like that hit the general fund, that's why you see that dip. Without that, it was roughly about 31%. And that's what we try to do and what rating agencies really want to see. They don't want to see a ping pong effect unless you can clearly demonstrate that it's targeted for a certain way. Kind of going on, we've been very fortunate with the growth in the village from an equalized value perspective. So as the village's assets in every property value goes up, it allows us to have additional capacity. Kind of some of the things I've mentioned to this committee and the board in the past is just because we have more debt capacity doesn't mean we should necessarily target a certain percentage of debt that we should be. So I know in the capital prioritization guidelines it says, we shouldn't be more than 75%. That's also not saying we should aim to have 75% of our debt at any given time. That we need to be looking at what is the tax impact of taking said debt out. And strategically, does that debt make sense? So as you can see, there was some capacity obviously generated from 2025 where we had less debt in 25, but more capacity with almost $400 million of equalized value from the Amazon facility in 2026, even with the debt that was taken out for the police station this past year. We're very fortunate that we're not going to be bumping above 50% of our debt capacity, which I think is a great achievement when investing in such a significant facility for 2026 and 2027. And that the debt capacity as a percentage was 41% at the end of 2025. It's really important to note for this committee that we do have debt outside of GO debt, and that's carried by the utilities, and it's referred to revenue debt. We've been very fortunate as a utility that we can take out less revenue debt and take out more GO debt because we can issue GO debt at a lower interest percentage than revenue debt. Because when we take out GO debt, we're basically saying no matter what, we are going to levy what it takes to make our debt service payment. When you have utility debt, you're saying the only way I'm securing this debt is if I collect enough user fees to be able to pay debt. And so they view the rating agencies and people who are acquiring this debt view that as a slightly riskier investment. And so that in turn has higher percentages. Where it benefits to communities, like if we see a dip in our median income compared to the state, sometimes the state or the Environmental Improvement Fund has programs where a certain portion of the debt is granted, or you have a granted portion of the interest where if we would go out to market, it would be 4%, but the state would give us a loan for 2%. And so because our median income is what it is, we are oftentimes we don't get prioritized at the higher level. So until that metric switches, the recommendation would continue to be that GO debt is probably the best route for those utility improvements. So this graph just represents what our debt service is to non-capital expenditures. Important metric certainly when we're looking at this, because this is representing of our overall budget, how much of our budget is going to debt and how much is going to everything else. I had a question, there was a question of this on the village board level, kind of how this compares. Currently, these median references are for communities that are below 10,000 population. I got the data for communities that are between 10 and 15,000 population. And so for 2021, that's roughly 21.24%. For 2022, that's 21.23%. For 2023, it's 17.27%. In 2024, it's 18.91%. And again, those are our median numbers. So kind of it's elevated certainly compared to what the median is for what's in there, but not materially different from those median metrics. Because this committee doesn't have purview over water and sewer, just high level, there was a governmental question that was raised by the board on this as what would be the equivalent. There's this investment in capital and how much is equity compared to debt on the governmental side. So on the water side, we see about 81% equity, 19% debt. Sewer side, 83% equity, 17% debt. On the governmental side, we see 40.41% equity, 59.59 debt funded. And really, what that highlights is under the levy structure, in a perfect world, we could be able to levy for capital equipment and capital things like we can do on the water and sewer utility, where we can bake it into our fees to take out the minimum debt possible. And so this is that, and I'm going to do a little bit of research to see how that compares to other municipalities. But that's really the difference between being able to control how much you can charge for your service as opposed to relying on a state formula. Any questions on the financial statements or highlight graphs? Again, I could talk about this for hours.
And I just add that it was talked about for hours. And I think that for the statements and the highlights, independent analysis by Baker Tilly, if anyone wants to go back, if you're watching this now, the May 4th meeting has the recording of Amanda's presentation of these statements as well. Open it up for questions from the committee. All right.
So one of the things a question gets asked is oftentimes in the budget that's provided to the village board, we wait until the financial statements are issued before making a decision on what to include in the financial management plan. So if there's net or reserves that are going to either be used to offset capital purchases or future debt service, we want to finalize what our 2020 again or the prior year before. So that's why, like in 25, started with a zero budget, took it down, tried to spend down 150,000. One of the purchases that might be coming up in the 2026 budget is the need to replace and will be coming kind of through the committee and the village board as a street sweeper. And the goal would be we have elevated reserves, and so we don't want to tie these to a reoccurring expense like hiring personnel, but this is certainly from a $400,000 piece of equipment perspective, abating that to the extent possible with reserves that are available, as well as we've had some cost efficiencies, which I'll go over in the vehicle and equipment kind of summary here in the next agenda item.
No. Seeing no questions from the committee, should we move on to the presentation of the year-to-date actual status? So you've got 5 attachments in there. So the financial management plan, which we go through the budget process. Obviously, we're kicking it off tonight, but we approved that in September of each year, after we meet as a committee in August. The sale report for Geo Notes in 2026 that occurred in March. I'm just kind of referencing so people can go back to the previous meetings and watch that if they're interested. The budget amendments, 01 and 02, do you have a reference of when those were presented to the board?
When they load.
Okay. And then there's
so
the budget to actuals, which was in our May meeting. And then you have our capital projects update, which I know committees get snapshots of throughout the year, but it's nice to have it all in one document here for us.
Yeah, so I think I'll start here with kind of what the current roles and responsibilities from a budget to actual perspective. So the board is viewing budget to actual quarter by quarter, so for in the first quarter, second, third, or fourth quarter. Every month, though, so we have an internal deadline that by the 15th date of the following month, the subsequent month is completely reconciled, meaning we have all bank recs done, we have all of our internal control processes documented, and we start the process for each department to review. So each department then has from the 15th to the 30th of the subsequent month to reach out to Cassie or myself with questions, inquiries, if something was either less expensive or more expensive than they anticipated, or why, documenting those questions. And that happens on a monthly basis. From a shareholder perspective, we implemented the transparency portal so that it is uploaded on a monthly basis. And we do spend a decent amount of time making sure that's updated. I would say we get the amount of views, Inga had it in her communication summary that was sent to the board, was actually higher than I anticipated it to be, which is a great feeling because when you put all that time and effort into that, it's great knowing that the community is using that. So we continue to try to put information out there for shareholders to also ask questions. So we ask the board to give us feedback, we ask the departments to give us feedback, and the community can give us feedback. All really kind of important, critical in protecting government assets. So then I'll kind of switch gears now, and we're kind of to the point of the year where we're in the process, the preliminary stages of updating the financial management plan. So as we kind of look at from a historical perspective, so the financial management plan was approved on September 2nd. And so obviously that's approved prior to the final budget document. So one of the places, we'll start here. So one of the things that has been historically updated by staff is coming up with these general assumptions for 20, like in this case, 2027, 2028, 2029, what are some generalized factors we're going to use for projecting future expenditures? To some extent, we try to be a little conservative here because I would rather say that insurance here is going to go up 5% in our forecasting, but if we can negotiate and get better rates or modify deductible levels and it's only 2%, that's great. This is essentially trying to paint a worst case situation. Unfortunately, in the last couple years with where inflations are, we're doing really well, but we've been closer, especially on some of like the service areas. That 2% is if we can keep service levels at no more than a 2% increase. I'm doing backflips when departments are able to do that. And certainly there's budgets that are larger departments. So the larger departments, those are the ones that there's likely, when we're able to look at that or we're looking at contracts or services, there's sometimes more of an opportunity to find savings. Some departments are one person, like our planning and development. So the likelihood we're going to find significant savings in those departments oftentimes are slim to none. We have, for example, contracts for GIS. We know what that's going to be this year and next year and next year, unless we're willing to renegotiate those contracts. I would say, from a budget review perspective, in this meeting, either direction or subsequent meeting, if the budget review committee wants a financial management plan that has modeled at different levels, that's great, but we would certainly come and say, if we do this, there may be some either service reductions or some meaningful steps that we are going to need to do. And ultimately, if we're asked as an administration team to, let's say, cut the budget by 2% or have a 0% budget, we would want to bring that back to the board and even this committee and say, we're not going to say where to cut. We're going to need some just general direction. We can give you certainly some opportunities, but ultimately, the role of administration is kind of monitoring and providing updates on the budget. Those critical policy decisions are budget review and the board. And then next here on the financial management plan, we have the actual levy table. So the plan had a $6,853,087 levy for 2026. We came with a final levy of $6,512,526, or $340,561 less than what was approved. We were able to accomplish that a couple different ways. So TID 5 was closing, so we had some surplus money that was going into the general fund and debt service. We had some 411 capital expenditures where some proceeds were returned to the debt service fund to reduce the borrowing. So what that allows us to do, though, is always trying to come back with, again, I would like to be a little bit closer, but I'd rather be $340,000 in the positive than coming back and saying, oof, I need $50,000 more than what was the general parameters. So for example, of an activity that's happening between now and when you guys eventually see a financial management plan, on Monday night I went to the fire commission meeting, and they brought up during last year's budget, they talked about the LOSA program, and they said, well, we're going to do paid per call and prioritize that this year, but we want to maybe look at that for 2027. And so one of the agenda items that was talked about was bringing that forward. Well, we're certainly going to want to model it in here because it's going to have a current year impact and potentially future. So I would much rather have that built into this model than come back to the board and say, I'm sorry, I didn't factor in this other expenditure that's there. Similarly, we try to kind of use metrics from a staffing perspective. So we do build staffing increases in here. So if we have to hire another police officer, public works technician, other stuff, we typically try to use the development data that we have from a growth perspective to kind of anticipate when we're going to hit some of those levels. So those are the kind of activities that are being done in construction of this budget. And so if we kind of go back to that last page, the last page I would say is that cost to continue budget. So this would be your existing, but if we're adding staffing, they're obviously much more than a 3% increase when you're talking about getting over salaries and benefits. Typically, the steps to adding additional resource starts on the consulting perspective and then evolves into a part-time position, and then goes finally into full-time staffing. That is all my notes on the financial management plan. I could stop at the financial management plan. I got some notes to talk about some of the other documents.
Can I just ask, on the screen you have up, so will you be looking for direction from us that, for instance, commodities, if we think fuel and mileage and that sort of thing, really we should bump that up to 3%? That's what you're talking about with the modeling. So we could say, just in case.
Yeah, I would say really letting this be a budget review committee, whatever direction you would like to provide. But yes, because right now, currently staff are independently calculating these assumptions, which again, if you guys got it at budget review and we're like, gosh, we really think that 2% is low, it's easier to do that now before you're having, because then you're like, okay, well now I'm approving something, I don't know what the subsequent numbers are. So if at the end of this discussion, we want to provide some guidance on maybe some of these preliminary, or providing ranges. So if we think 2% isn't, if we think, 2 to 4% is good, bring forward why you ultimately chose a certain percentage. That's something that we could do for the next meeting. Good question. All right.
Keep going.
This is like my favorite thing to talk about, so you guys are just making my night. All right, so the next document, so I included the sales report in here just because it has the most updated information regarding what our current geo capacity is after issuing this debt. in comparison to what our estimated equalized value is. So we obviously issued debt for to fund our capital projects, the largest being the police station, followed closely by Well 2 and the looping project. Just a special note, Well 2 will have a second part of the borrowing because there was while we're going to have some cost savings with that project turned in from a 12-month project to like a 18, 19-month project. We didn't feel like we wanted to take all that debt out at once, and we're more appropriately separating it to have some cost savings on interest savings. It also allows us to see another year's worth of financial results, so we can even make a decision to further reduce that borrowing with user fees. There's a relatively large planned capital purchase on the water side with replacing meters in a couple years. So instead of hiring the additional staff and personnel and having the software to do the change-out management, the initial plan is over a 3-year course of time to have that service contracted out where they go in, they replace the meters. That way we're not hiring a whole bunch of staff to replace all these meters and then saying, okay, we don't have that capacity anymore. And when that's obviously done, so that's going to be almost $300,000 over a 3-year time frame. So if we're looking here at very similar tables to the financial management plan, this is the table that kind of drawing your guys' attention to. So after the reduced borrowing, because the financial management plan laid out, if we took out all the projects at the highest opinion of probable cost provided by Strand, what it would be, this was what the actual results were based off. So I was really pleased when I saw that after that we were at that 48.88%, and further pleased by some of the projects that came out even more efficient after the fact, with 2026 streets doing well. So that's kind of where we're sitting. So this is, if we didn't take out any additional debt, this is how quickly debt could come off, and kind of coming up with so if we're kind of looking at our 2031 time frame, again, we don't have any the PA study for additional facilities for fire and EMS hasn't been finalized, but just from a capital planning perspective, staff have really viewed 2031 as kind of that target date of when we may need to make a significant investment in facilities again. And so kind of we're in that in between on a remodel, again, these are high level numbers, could be $2 to $4 million. A new facility could be 8 to 10. So we've chosen to model a $8 to $10 million substation in our capital plan, at least for the board to consider, just to make sure that we have enough capacity to make sure that public safety is taken care of. Because we've kind of started that. We start top down, public safety is addressed, and we kind of work down when we're talking about critical services. Any questions on this chart?
Cameron, so is that placeholder for public safety factored into this proposed debt, or it will be then probably this year?
So in the financial management plan, that will show the anticipated, so that will actually have the table with the anticipated borrowings, which will show it really, from the last time I remember seeing it, we really sit between that 35% and 50% over that 10-year plan, just depending on one of these critical facilities. Well 2 being an entirely GO-funded project, that would have been another like $2 million that could have been revenue debt and not counted towards this percentage, but is because of that. Similar with any improvements that's done at any, so we've talked about Ridge Lift Station. If we've had to take some GO debt, that's up to a $7 million project. So depending on where, those are the type of things that I always caution people at looking at the pure percentage perspective. It's also important to know how much is actually hitting the levy. So one of the things we talked about last year during this process is what is our actual debt percentage that's hitting the levy? because that puts us more of an apple to apples to our competitors, Windsor, DeForest, the communities that we're trying to evaluate ourselves against, similar growth rates, similar infrastructure age, et cetera. Windsor, for me, is a good comparison in a lot of sense because of the service levels that they have. They have a shared service with the forest for EMS. They don't have a library. They offer relatively similar park programming, but again, there's a lot of different. Their EMS and fire model is different than ours. They have contracted PD as opposed to a full-time department. So that's always the difficulty of looking at what we call peer communities. We try to get it down to apples and apples as much as possible. And that's really where when we look at when benchmarking is so key in budgeting, really going onto the Wisconsin Policy Forum, they have comparable data for all the municipalities in Wisconsin. The only downside to that data is typically it's about a year and a half old, but it doesn't mean that information isn't valuable because if we're out of whack in a spending category, it's worth investigating. So if we're spending on average $50 more per resident on a certain line item or certain service level, we should at least know why that is. You know, what are we doing different on that service compared to a different community?
So just to circle back quick, I appreciate all the explanation. So on table 6, the existing debt versus proposed debt, that's just proposed for this sale.
For this,
Not like the whole FMP. We'll have that for the FMP when we evaluate that next meeting, right?
Yep, and so after the board kind of goes through that prioritization process, we'll turn over those projects to the financial management plan. So this is a snip from the financial management plan that shows kind of the plan spending over the course of the plan, including with water and sewer. So this is, again, that level that stays relatively the same. Now it's a little bit, it's not a little bit, it's significantly less than what was here because we reduced the borrowing rather significantly compared to this plan. What throws a huge wild card into a lot of this is how quickly is capacity needed or driven by development. So on our side with roads and things, that's easy, relatively easy. Water and sewer capital planning is very complex and very capital intensive. And so all of a sudden, if we trigger a need for like an additional water tower or well, and if we truly are gonna do geo debt, that's where you could see those unplanned, really high spikes in geo capacity going down. I argue all the time with S&P about why are we saying that it's elevated when this much of our debt is on the utilities, and financial statements from B community has more debt than us, but because they chose not to take out geo debt, they're not getting penalized for it essentially. So it's one of those things that we're constantly evaluating. If there's some reason that we would pass a metric in the S&P scoring grade, it might change how from a philosophy perspective, we might be willing to take a 20 basis point in interest increase on one project to overall have a slightly higher debt rating, which will save us money on all the additional borrowings. And it kind of goes into that kind of pros con list every year that we kind of go through as we go through this process.
I'm jumping ahead, but will the potential of a stormwater utility play any role particularly in debt, but kind of overall budget?
Great question. So the stormwater utility, one of the greatest strengths of that utility is, again, shifting to a user fee method. So that means we're no longer constrained for utility improvements to be under the levy. So we can strategically plan to build capital improvements in our rates to reduce the need for capital borrowing. There are, and there will be a presentation on August 17th I think is a Monday. That will be the when the board will choose to either go forward with the utility or not, and there'll be a much more comprehensive presentation. It's likely going to show we get pretty high value buying into Yahara Winds from a budgetary perspective. So we're not going to build a $2 million stormwater pond to save $1,000 on our buy-in. We'll pay the $1,000 buy-ins to Yahara Winds and let that buy the credits that are needed to stay in compliance. Where this becomes more beneficial is, and I look at it as real community impacts, it will allow us to be able to, for the ponds and retention ponds that we have, to be a little bit more proactive in maintenance and dredging and cleaning, to make sure if we have those storm events that we're staying, making sure we're staying compliant and making sure that the water has somewhere to ultimately go. So yes, it will. The goal of that is, with that in mind, that minimizing any debt that needs to be taken out from a water, sewer, and storm perspective. Great question. I didn't bring water. That was a mistake. All right. So obviously you guys reviewed the preliminary budget that was brought forward. There's 2 budget amendments. There's a third one that will be presented on July 20th. So the first amendment is primarily just dealing with the effect of capital expenditures don't always go when planned. So because we work on an annual appropriation basis, we have to appropriate the funds every year if we're going to spend those. So this budget amendment, along with its counterpart 2025, which is not in front of us, decreased expenditures in 25, budgeted expenditures, but increased the budget capacity for 25, just moving fiscal years. So nothing in here was asking for additional funding. In Budget Amendment 2020-602, this was to account for the actual sale, because when we do our budget, and this is up here how the board wants to see it. It's so hard to know and estimate what the premium on debt issuance is going to be and debt issuance cost. I've let that proceeds bucket be a fill until we know what that final borrowing, and ultimately come forward with a budget amendment to capture what that final activity is. So historically, we've been able to issue debt at a premium, meaning not only will we have enough money on the sale to cover debt issuance costs through premium, so it basically wipes that out. We also have some money set aside to reduce what we have to levy for future debt service payments. And that's the thing, just depending on market conditions and why your bond rating matters so much. That has a material impact on what you can get for your premium on debt service. Oh, you're the best. Similarly, when we bring projects forward, we don't necessarily, we're using what's called 90% drawings or opinions of probable cost. And so when projects come back and we have the bids, we don't want to have a budget that we know we're not, like, we have a contract approved for 800,000, but the budget was approved as $1 million. We want to make sure that we're being fiduciary responsible. We're reducing the budget to what we actually need, because the intent of the board is not to find additional things to spend that money on that if the board wants to give us direction to have that $200,000 and find a additional pulverization or other project to do, we want to make sure that we're reducing our spending authority in consistency with what the board expectations are. And that's primarily why we bring budget amendments forward. So I will say there was action taken on the annual streets program to reduce it by 52 million. Originally, the Johnson Health Tech was taken out of the bid, and then it was brought back in. So the budget amendment that will be presented for the board for consideration, or part of that, will include adding that expenditure authority back for 50,000. Any questions on the budget amendment process?
Nope, the first budget amendment was for the February 16th meeting, and then the second budget amendment was in April 6th. And then you said we'll have another one in July.
And all of the stuff is posted on the website. So we have a separate page that will have, it's the annual budget under the finance division, and it will have all the budget meetings and updates. It will list out all the quarterly budget to actuals, and it will have all the amendments and kind of where we are in the process. We try to keep that up to date.
Well, I think that leads us into discussing the budget to actuals, which go through May of this year.
That's the one document I'm not going to talk through here. If there's any questions, I can certainly answer them. This one's a little unique because we weren't past kind of our review period of getting expenditures back to May, but it is relatively close to expectations. We've already made adjustments to account for overages expected as on vehicles. We've had a couple insurance claims where we've gotten the revenue, but we need to go to the board and account for that additional insurance revenue and increase the associated expenditure with it because we have to replace that item. But other than that, building permits is going to come better than expected. Mostly, single family homes is probably a little down compared to normal, but we were conservative in that building permit number just in case we missed that threshold because we don't want to count on building permit revenue to offset expenditures and not have that revenue.
Yeah, questions on this document from the board or from the committee?
I think one of the overages I noticed was in insurance, the property liability. Is that,
That's part of the, yep.
that's part of the,
So, yep, and so this is year 2 or 3 with the insurance company. We've really dove in the last couple of years, and again, Cassie's been great on this too, going through our statement of values for what our insurance is and right sizing what the coverage it needs for replacement value. Noticing there was maybe a couple things that maybe weren't on things. So you'll see one of those line items were above, one of those items were below. They don't quite offset each other, but ultimately the budget amendment is going to try to get those items lined up. You worked on, and what was one of the bigger vehicles were way higher. I remember that vehicle insurance for some reason. The estimated premium was way higher than expected. There is some opportunity in deductible levels on the property insurance for cost savings. And I say some opportunity because that assumes nothing bad happens. So it's kind of like kind of in that scheme of risk management. Where are we willing to have risk exposure? Trying to think.
I just was,
Yeah.
just picked up on that and didn't know if there were additional expenditures that we still need to pay in that regard throughout the rest of the year, or if it's all just kind of done.
Yep. So those expenditures are paid on an annual basis.
Okay.
So great question. So what you're referring to here is this line item here. So we have one line item that's above over budget by 6,800 and one that's below by 54. I am hopeful that our workers' comp mod stays where it is because we have an extremely low workers' comp mod and that has a huge impact on premiums. So fingers crossed on that. I think too, what's been a struggle is similar to the way houses are appreciating. All of the assets that the village own are appreciating at such a high level. And so if I had to think about how inflation was affecting the village, that would be the biggest area that those kind of indirect costs on insurance and other type of items is where we're kind of seeing that.
Any other questions?
I was just going to make one more note. And it looks like interest on investments is doing really well. So do you have a forecast as to what you expect since it's already that high?
Great question. So, yes. So from January through May, just from a levy perspective, the general fund benefits from money so we have what's called pooled cash. So the way that we allocate pooled cash is kind of our ending balance at the end of the month. We take and allocate the interest to each fund. From January through May, we do not allocate any interest income to the TID funds. From June through December, any funds after paying their obligations, we start to allocate that out. So you typically see January through May, the highest month for the general fund, and then again, September through December. I anticipate interest income, and we've talked about that to some extent. Depending on how the investment portfolio, I anticipate that to be about $250,000, which again would lead to some opportunities. I will say that's offset slightly by the SRO is probably going to be closer to 120,000 because we're switching SROs for the fall semester, and the school district reimburses us based off of actual expenses, including benefits. So when somebody had family coverage for insurance, and that changes that request for the second half. So good for the district, but again, I'm seeing when I'm looking at revenues in total, I anticipate to be about 102% of planned revenues when I'm looking at things in totality. So again, an opportunity for some investment. When we kind of talk about that street sweeper, that was kind of one of the areas I looked at as an opportunity to continue pay down what that future obligation would be. We did, knock on wood, or having our facility roofs checked after the last storm. Obviously, we have deductibles for that, so making sure that we're not having to have any storm damage repairs too is kind of broadly factored in. Any other questions? Everyone just wants to talk about the general fund. Nobody wants to talk about some of the other fund funds.
Why don't you give us an update? Or are we done with this one?
We can be done with this one. Let's see,
Okay.
we can do capital.
Okay.
Okay, so capital is obviously our biggest area of expenses. I had put together, this was a document we ultimately thought was a good idea to be presenting to the board on a monthly basis. This just started for the first time last month, and the goal would be to continue to provide this, because while we look at the budget, there's a lot of things, like even for the police budget, there's a lot of things that when we're looking at a budget to actual, they're all going to be hitting this one line, and that doesn't give you a lot of detail on how are each individual projects or equipment coming back from an overall perspective. So kind of if we take this from a bucket by bucket approach, for general government, I've been holding off on, there's not really good pricing right now because of the cost of RAM and other things for our computer replacement program. So I'm trying to identify some cost with Johnson Block, some potential cost savings. Election equipment will follow in a subsequent meeting, but we had planned to replace some equipment. Replacing some equipment also has other things that it will impact, so we might have a conversation about maybe reducing that in 26 and including the additional equipment we want to replace in 27. So more information to come on that. For police, going to come under on the 2 squads and upfitting. So right now we're roughly about 35,000 below budget, which is great. All of this will get wrapped into, we basically take our savings. And so in this case, we can identify, okay, well, 2027, we need to do a street sweeper, or if we use that this year to get that need, it's money that we don't have to ask for additional resources for. So again, right now, most of those purchases are significantly under budget. You know, the tornado siren, you know, again, $15,000 under budget. So all of those things kind of add up. Fire is just a little bit over. There was some value there with getting the additional thermal imaging cameras. So the fire department is going to take a little bit of operating funds to cover those additional cameras because of the value that they were able to get by getting those 6. For public works and utilities, most of these purchases are also very close to be completed. Opportunity here, if we need to replace these barriers in 2027 to free up some resources to again make that down payment on a street sweeper, certainly can do that. There'll be more to come with that at a public works meeting. Parks and forestry, we're going to be pretty significantly under budget so the board had asked us to do those ADA and parking lot improvements by Miracle Field. So the only anticipated expense I see coming down the pipeline is $14,000 to kind of finish up that project. Major capital projects here. So those are kind of our big ticket items. So Shady Grove Park, again, original budget of $575, because that's a lot of these expenditures are projects that happen over either 2 or more years. So I included a total cost to date, but also what our budget and year-to-date cost was for this year. We were really happy with the water looping number that came back. We originally planned that to be a $1.7 million expense. It was 1.3. This engineering for the project at the 615 came actually under. So there'll be some future adjustments to what that number is. And then with the BB bus path and Damascus, there's some cost share there too with the district that we got some additional revenue for. So no concerns on any of these projects thus far. We really know where our projects are going to end up for the year for the most part in about August. But no other concerns to note. Any questions on active capital projects? You guys are taking it easy on me.
Well, if there are no questions from the board or from the committee, that wraps up the second presentation of the night from the year-to-date actual status. Should we move on to a presentation of major service delivery model providers? Which there's a memo in the packet. And then for reference, we typically we break this up over 4-ish meetings in August and September. Last year, you can go back into the agendas if you're interested, and find those service providers from August 4th and 18th, and then September 2nd and 15th. They come in, they give their presentation, and the board is allowed to ask questions. But why don't you tell us what you do internally, and who our contracts are with and what they do?
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning the last year dates. I would say too, if there's community members listening, when or if you see that on the agenda, if there's certainly feedback that you would like to email the village board to forward on questions or getting answers, while the board can't indirectly or directly act on when people speak at the beginning of the meetings, we can certainly bring questions from the public and ask questions or get clarifications for. But then we also have, we will release in the month of July 2027 community budgeting feedback. And so there's certainly opportunities to put that feedback in those forms as well. So list out here these, and it's hard because it's hard to define what major is. we detailed out to the extent that we felt that had been kind of in alignment with what has been the expectations for providers. I do notice that we missed Briar Patch on here. Again, that was not intentional, but Briar Patch does our youth
Restorative justice.
restorative justice
I
program.
was just saying, there's, I think, the benefit of having, we go through these reviews every year, and, staff give feedback to the board, and we can get feedback from residents. But there's been, I think, 2 examples I can think of. One was Briar Patch and the consolidation of our restorative justice program into LAC, and then using Briar Patch as a consultant, which we kind of had, but it went through a different pathway, so we kind of streamlined that. And then Colonial Club providing our senior services, and kind of revamping, working on that MOU with Melody, and that really, I think, put us in a really good direction for using our consultants kind of to the maximum and making sure that we're getting the most out of it.
Yeah, and I think that was the Colonial Club too was an important one that I think there was some identified communication things that we felt needed to be kind of improved. So being able to work, because that's when the relationships work best, when we can bring forward, if there's corrections that need to be made from a service delivery perspective, that feedback's always welcome. So I kind of put these in 2 different banks per se. So like assessor, building inspector, attorney, IT, engineering, those are senior services to some extent. Those are services that could, in theory, be replaced with full-time staff. There's a couple things in here, such as I guess we could hire and have our own garbage trucks. But things like our insurance, unless the community is looking for us to go self-insured, or our independent audit firm, those have to be with an outside organization. As much as I would like to independently audit our information and save money on that, kind of we're missing a key word there. So one of the things, I guess the common question I get, because if you look at the bills list that comes to the village board, so you could either see Strand or Stafford, and it's broken up into, let's say, 20 lines. I think it's important to note when we, as the budget review or community members or the board, those 3-digit numbers in front of each of those codes mean something. So if it's charged to 100, in theory, that's the general fund, that project is being supported by a levy. If has 205, that's likely being supported by park development fees. 210, developers are reimbursing us for any of those costs. So historically, what I see is huge spikes and valleys in the fund 210, because that time doesn't occur if there's nothing to review. So larger projects like Amazon and Heyday and Authentics and other projects like that, you would expect to see engineering and legal time to be relatively extensive. Where I see a little bit more stability, or where I focus on in the general fund, is, are we seeing reasonable increases year over year? And what were those increases for? Was it increases because we needed more hours? Was it a board directive where we wanted to take on updating several, more ordinances or things than were average? Just making sure we can explain those things. Yeah.
And I think staff have done a good job of giving the board information too about our providers, and we've made adjustments over the years too, of where maybe engineering wasn't meeting standards on projects, and we've looked to other firms. We've made switches.
I kind of have two.
Same thing with like IT.
2 examples. So through my experience, we would never continue to recommend working with a provider if they said you need a 20% increase. So what ended up happening in this specific example is our assessor firm, Associated, it's not that we were unhappy with their performance by any means, but they were asking for a material increase in their annual maintenance costs. So we took that fiduciary responsibility to request proposals, had Accurate and Associated, ultimately went with Associated, and through that process, there was some knowledge that, okay, because we had been a 20+ year client, they had kept their prices back. Again, everybody knows how quickly the village has grown, but we had kind of had a sweetheart contract there for several years, and then it was finally time for an adjustment to be made. So that was one where ultimately we felt the best value was sticking with that firm. And then most recently, we will start to work with, so attorneys are multiple fold, but so one of the services that Stafford provides is our municipal court support. So one of the things that was identified in this beginning of the year, and to Stafford's credit, they came to us and said, it might be time to look for an alternate option for municipal court services, one that has maybe a little bit more of a cost-effective approach. So that is definitely something that we'll work with the judge and the board on kind of what that process looks like. And I think for the most part, that's been the best thing with the people who are working for, even if it's not in their best interest, they're telling us, which is nice because they do feel like a lot of, they do feel a part of the community. And then with IT, there's certain things that IT is doing where because they're doing it, we're getting additional insurance coverage through some active monitoring. And so obviously everybody's seen, we need to make sure our SCADA systems are protected, water, sewer, and other municipal infrastructure. So having that additional insurance level, and even on top of that, having our network and everything else being actively monitored 24/7, 365 is a strength. So there's definitely things that if there's a provider that would like to be looked at, it's kind of peeling back those onions and seeing what are you getting for this price, and certainly can bring any analysis forward that is directed by budget review or the board. So you guys have heard me talk a lot, so I'll sit back and answer any questions you may have.
When you have the dates and when each provider is going to come, will you email not only the village board, but also the committee?
Yep.
Thanks.
And I will be asking providers, so I try to get on the after 4th of July, so to send out that communication, hey, we're starting the review process, first come, first serve. So that communication will likely be going out the week of July 6th. It will take me about a week and a half to get those dates determined.
I think I might have raised this request during a village board meeting that when those providers come, if it's possible, and it doesn't necessarily need to, be spoken at the meeting, but in a memo or something to give an idea of their costs just to the general fund, the levy, right? Like not all the other funds, just to have a ballpark to say, okay, for the building inspectors, like this comes out of general funds, this dollar amount. So just from a transparency point that the public kind of knows, like how much are we paying for these, attorneys or consultants a year, just a ballpark number. It doesn't have to be broken out. I think that just helps give a point of reference when they're talking about their services and what they provide, gives value, so.
I guess I would, one thing in working with these kind of interviews over time, I think they are beneficial to have that presentation every year because we didn't always have that. So I do like that we do that. And I think it is always interesting to hear about how many people really work on projects for the village. We may just see like 1 or 2 faces at our meetings, but when you hear about all the people working behind the scenes to produce the products, I think it's you can really see the value added at those presentations when they talk about how many people are working on the various projects for us. So I think, that's one benefit of having them here and talk about the services that they provide. Thanks.
And those presentations are every much as whatever the board and those questions are being asked, you're going to get out of it what questions that are asked. So I always say it might be uncomfortable asking a question in that meeting, but I would strongly recommend they don't mind those questions. I think we've solved a lot of problems by getting questions out, up front and making sure people are prepared instead of stewing over something, because that's ultimately what we're being asked to by the taxpayer.
And I think you've also sent out communication to the board before that meeting too, to gather questions so that they make sure that they address whatever they need to address in their presentations. If you could do that again, that's helpful.
And there's some operational things where there's a little bit of a cross. So I think the most common question I get is the village ever going to do any type of bulk item pickup event or whatever outside of e-waste? So that obviously a request would have to come from, or I guess not have to, but the flow would be to having it come through Public Works. And so that's not necessarily a service delivery question, but it's definitely something that if the board wants to direct Public Works to look into, that would be a really good appropriate time to say, hey, can we look into providing this service? It's really challenging because I don't think a bulk item, and this is a perfect example, I don't think a bulk item drop-off event is actually going to solve what the need is, and that's people who don't have vehicles to transfer these bulk items. And so it's that kind of that compromise on what is the best solution to these events, and allowing that brainstorming to be done. We try to, when we get complaints or other things, make sure that we're passing those feedback along to those different committees or boards, so service delivery could be adjusted if needed.
So Paula's comment on the, do you envision like a budget to actual from the general fund for service providers, or what's I just want to make sure you have the direction that.
Yeah, I mean, just, so if they're coming into us in 26, we just say in 2025, for this service, we paid out of the general fund, right? Just to get a ballpark idea.
And that's certainly something I could send out to the board.
Yeah.
With the schedule saying, here's a reminder, this is the general impact on these services. I have no problem doing that.
That's great.
And then they typically come back with, I know like Colonial Club, for example, brings their budgets.
Right.
So, and when all the budgets are due, like everyone knows that September 30th is the day.
I just want to go back to the bulk items and such for a second. So are all of our presentations, they're all given with enough time if we wanted to change some service, like let's say we wanted one free item a bulk item that could be picked up in our contract. There's enough time from when Pelletary presents and we ask them about that to get a proposal from them, how much that would cost, and then we can put that into our budget if that's something we want to implement.
The great way about how Pelletary provided their contract, we have all that information. So, and Todd is actually great. It's been night and day difference from Waste Management that if we wanted it the next month, we could implement a service if needed. I think like kind of going down that path, every week recycling is brought up every once in a while. Again, why the village chose not to do that was we also get feedback on the other side, maybe some elderly, people are not filling their cans that they have. So to do it every week, it would be spreading that cost on it regardless of when you use that service. And since you have the ability to get a second can, yes, it's got a cost to you. it's like, okay, well then the people who are using it are paying that cost. Because that's what the goal is. We want to make sure we're assigning the cost to the people who are using the service when it's appropriate.
That's good to know about Pelletary too, and
Yeah.
how, I guess then that made me think of one other question. It probably most specifically references Pelletary, like fuel surcharges. We didn't talk too much about like when our costs are, are our costs exceeding? Do they charge us fuel surcharges if they're experiencing higher, like our,
Yep. So yeah, 100%. So there is a fuel price that at a certain point after that, I believe it's above $4, pretty easily, above 4 or 5. We have, and you were like within $50 last month when I asked you to look at that in March, which is crazy. And so there's a table that by cart number of stops, what that surcharge would be. Where that benefits us though is if we kind of look at our waste management counterpart, they built that contingency in their rate, and even at what we're paying, we're still less than what that proposal was. So that's where reserves, I think, are powerful in an aspect that this feels okay to draw down or have an expenditure higher than what was anticipated, because I wouldn't want to charge residents like 102% of the cost to cover that 2% contingency on maybe we're going to get those fuel surcharge. But again, that's policy decision where if you would like me to build in contingency in that pricing, I certainly can. But I'm okay eating that a little bit because especially we're having good budget performance elsewhere.
yeah, it doesn't always occur, so it seems like to always build that in.
And Pelletary ate the surcharge for 2 months this year. And so I called them, I thanked them for that. And it's a really good relationship. I think because they're a local community, they really care about their partners. And when we were doing that proposal, a powerful statistic, they haven't lost a single client that they've ever had. And so I think that's willing to show that they're really willing to remediate and fix any issues. You're always going to have something that happens. And while we see complaints and things come through, we're getting answers. We're not waiting a week to get an answer. So I think people feel comfortable submitting a complaint because they know they're going to get an answer. They know it's not like, I'm just going to say this and never get a response, so why bother? So we have seen that too. I don't necessarily look at complaints as a bad thing.
Okay. So coming up, next steps. Obviously tonight kicked it off for budget review, kind of with a summary of last year and how we're doing this year. And again, you can either watch this or go back into agendas and look at all of the different attachments and their full presentations to the board. And you also mentioned the transparency module and the budget website that's you can find both of those on the village website. Next steps for the village board is the prioritization process, which is due next week to you. And then there's a feedback form for residents to give feedback on the budget, anything budget related, starting next month, which is already next week. And then there's also going to be some budget info sessions, and there's office hours, and so there's hopefully a lot of opportunities for residents to engage in the process. We meet in August for the financial management review with Ellers, the plan review. And like you said at the very beginning, sometimes it's not unusual to have we ask for multiple scenarios within the plan, and then the village board would take action on that. And then operational-wise, all of the budgets for individual departments are due at the end of September, and then we meet again in October to look at the overall budget and the impact on the levy. So.
Yep, and the loan exception, I always try to just mention that with the water and sewer utility actually adopting their budget at their meeting, just with the difference in statutory authority. It is important to note that the mailer that we're anticipating to hit mailbox on 7/15 will have revaluation information in it. It will have stormwater utility information in it. I'm not quite sure if comp plan will hit that one, just depending on content due date. It might not make that. But the key financial one will be hitting mailbox is by 9/1 is the goal date. That is the financial heavy one that talks about here's the budget meetings on how to give and relevant timing because all the budget meetings are happening in. So you'll have the timeline, how to give feedback, and kind of just giving an overall update. And by the time we get to that, that will be our fourth mailer for the year, which is what the goal was. So really happy with that communication. It is heavy for the staff we have for mail communication like this is a big lift. So I really appreciate all the work that Inga and Matt put into that and working with staff to be able to produce. Similarly, it will be the little pitch, the project page on the village website is the best place to look for updates on projects, whether that be park projects, utility projects, developer projects. I encourage people, if they ever have questions on our big ticket items, that's a good place to go to.
Right. Well, if there are no other comments for tonight, we're on number 8.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, motion and a second, non-debatable. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, we're adjourned.